Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we have seen a remarkable shift in the way that the war is being fought. And a lot of people have noticed this shift, but not a lot of people have noticed the full significance of this shift. Where really this shift ultimately means, and I say this with a high level of confidence, that Russia is actually today completely incapable of actually winning the war. They're not incapable of fighting the war, they're still plenty capable of continuing to assault Ukraine, attack civilian infrastructure, cause casualties, everything like that. But they're not actually capable of winning the war anymore. And that is shown in the data and the progress on the battlefield from the early days when it's compared against the data and the progress on the battlefield that we see today. And the main shift that I'm talking about, there's several that we could hone in on, but the main shift I'm talking about is the degree to which Russia has been using tanks and armored vehicles to actually assault Ukrainian positions. Where early on in the war, they were able to use these, even though they took heavy casualties by doing so, to ultimately overwhelm certain Ukrainian positions in Ukrainian fortress cities like Avdiivka. But now, Russia no longer has the capability to do this anymore, and since Russia has lost this capability, they have essentially made no meaningful gains on the battlefield. They have advertised a lot of big gains. For example, they have said that they are about to take Pokrovsk over the past year or so, and they still haven't managed to take Pokrovsk. And the same thing is true of several other Ukrainian cities, to where even if Russia is having a slow crawling pace forward, they are actually incapable of mounting enough pressure to push through and take over Ukrainian fortresses. This is a remarkable shift that not a lot of people have noticed when it comes to the strategic picture, and when it comes to understanding why Ukraine is so confident and why Ukraine continues to fight against Russia today. And I want in this video today to put this shift in context, to show not only why these things that I've just said are true, but also to show why Russia is incapable of recovering from these trends. Today's episode was made possible by my sponsor, Incapable. Most people don't realize how often their data is bought and sold in today's world, and that's how a lot of problems often start, like scams, identity theft, online stalking, harassment, data breaches, and many more. A lot of this comes back to something that most people haven't even heard of: data brokers, entities who legally profit from publishing and selling deeply personal information. Things like your name, personal address, court records, or even your political views can be sold to anyone, from employers to landlords or even to complete strangers. Thankfully, Incapable can help. It automatically finds and removes your personal data from most sites all across the internet, and repeats that so your information doesn't reappear. Even better, Incapable's custom removal feature now lets you send specific links to their privacy experts for removal, giving you even more complete coverage. And with their unlimited plan, you can send as many links as you want. So choose Incapable to take back control of your personal data. Incapable offers a 30-day risk-free money-back guarantee. So try it out, give it a shot, and get a full refund if you're not 100% satisfied. Just click the link in the description and use my code Warburg to get 60% off an annual plan. Let me start this discussion with the actual data, because in every war, of course, both sides are going to have their propaganda, and that causes a lot of people to disbelieve the narratives and to simply think that we can't arrive at an actual conclusion about what's going on. But in this case, that's not true, because the data tells a very clear story. And the data that I'm talking about is something that anybody can verify by looking up, which is satellite imagery of Russian stockyards, in particular the stockyards that are storing old Soviet-era Russian tanks and old Soviet-era Russian infantry vehicles or other classes of armored vehicles. And when we look at these stockyards in satellite imagery from before the war to satellite imagery today at this point in the war, we see a remarkable picture. First and foremost, only about half, actually less than half of the original stocks remain in the stockyards. Now, half at first might sound like a lot, but that is until you look at additional details of these images of armored vehicles and tanks in Russian stockyards. Because when you look at the actual details, you realize that almost everything that is left in these stockyards has physically obvious deformities. So for example, you might see a stockyard full of tanks, but none of the tanks have turrets. And maybe the tanks are missing their tracks or missing other vital components, and the same is also true of armored vehicles. And what you start to realize when you see that is a very clear picture. When Russia started to rely on their Soviet-era stockpiles to fight the war, obviously a lot of that equipment had decayed. It had sat around, it had rusted, the electronics had gone bad, etc., etc., and it was very rare to actually find a unit that functioned properly. And so in order for Russia to get functioning units onto the battlefield, what they had to do is start tearing down other units until they got one functional unit that actually had all the pieces that it needed to operate. And that meant that when you looked at Russia's Soviet-era stocks, when you looked at the raw number, actually only about a third to a half of that raw number would ever be combat ready unless Russia actively was able to produce new components to make up for the gaps. And that is not something that Russia has demonstrated they're able to do. So today when we look at satellite imagery of the stockyards and we see roughly half, actually a little bit less than half of the vehicles remaining, and the vehicles that do remain having obvious gaps that will not allow them to fight, what that shows us is that Russia is not halfway through their stockpile. They are almost completely through their stockpile. Now, this is embarrassing, of course, for a lot of different reasons. First and foremost, Russia had advertised themselves as a modern, capable military who could take on pretty much any country in the world in a full-scale war. Russia, for a long time, people thought was the second most powerful military on the planet, second only to the United States. And so for Russia to even in the first place have to forego using modern equipment and have to rely on their Soviet-era gear to fight Ukraine, that was a little bit pathetic to begin with. But now that Russia has reached this point where they have not only stooped to using Soviet-era equipment, but they have used it so much that they have actually run out of it, that paints a very, very bad picture. And this picture is not something that's just speculated from looking at the stockyard imagery, although that does help give us a factual basis, but it's also something that we can see really clearly from the way that Russia has been using armored vehicles on the battlefield, which is that they have reduced the use of armored vehicles a huge amount, and they only rarely use armored vehicles in assaults today, and even then they typically get overwhelmingly destroyed by Ukrainian drones, but maybe it helps them get like a couple extra inches than they would if they were just using infantry. And so when we look at Russia's actual usage and what the satellite imagery shows, we see very clearly that Russia does not have enough armored vehicles to accomplish what they accomplished early on in the war. Now, that's obviously significant for a lot of reasons, but it's most significant because of what I said at the beginning of this video. These facts mean not only that Russia is in a bad position, but they actually mean that Russia is incapable of winning the war. And I want to explain that for several different reasons now. So first and foremost, when we look at the various defensive lines remaining in Ukraine today, and we compare those with the territory that Russia has already taken up to this point, we realize that in order for Russia to actually win the war, they would need to do what they have already accomplished at least 3, if not 4 or 5, or even 6 more times, because as Russia breaks through more defensive lines, additional defensive lines will be built. Russia right now really hasn't managed to take very many Ukrainian fortress cities. The ones they've taken that have been notable, for example, have been Bakhmut and Avdiivka. But ever since taking those cities, Russia has been trying to push forward, and they have not been capable of capturing additional Ukrainian cities. For example, the city of Pokrovsk, even if it does remain under intense pressure. For Ukraine, even if they were to lose this next line of fortress cities, they already have several lines of fortifications that they can fall back to, including lines of fortifications that are far harder to penetrate than the ones that Russia is currently unable to penetrate. And so that's the strategic situation of the war. And what we realize just on its surface is that Russia has to accomplish more than they've accomplished today with far less than they had at the beginning of the war. A lot of Russia's initial territorial gains were basically because they kind of caught Ukraine on the back foot. It was a full-scale invasion. It was a lot of different forces coming in, and they were able to push in rather quickly. But since then, Russia has been able to take almost nothing, and everything that they have taken has been because of these armored vehicles. So that's the logic on its surface, and it probably makes sense on its surface, but it also explains a lot of other things that we see on the battlefield in Ukraine today. For example, if you read news articles about the war in Ukraine, one thing that you will often read is how badly the Ukrainians are outnumbered. I just read one today about a city where the Ukrainians are outnumbered 8-1. There's 8 Russians for every single Ukrainian soldier. But what these news articles almost always fail to mention is why. Why the Ukrainians are so heavily outnumbered. And the reality is that one of the reasons that the Ukrainians are so heavily outnumbered is because they don't actually need additional forces to accomplish their goals. When we look at the front lines, even though newspapers have been telling us that Ukraine is outnumbered for years now, what is remarkable is that Russia has barely pushed forward at all. And so that means that Ukraine actually is not in this bad position that people think they are. Ukraine is actually in a position where, because Russia has now run out of armor, they can easily hold their defensive positions because of drones with far less forces than the enemy has. People are typically aware of general strategic environments where you need far more people on the offensive to take a defended position. You need to outnumber the opponent. But what the war in Ukraine is it is a first of its kind war in history. We don't actually know what the strong ratios are of how many forces you need to consistently overwhelm the enemy's defensive position. What we're finding is that because Russia now has no armor to support their infantry units, they have to outnumber Ukraine by ratios that we have never seen before in previous wars, and even those ratios are completely insufficient. Now, because of this dynamic, Ukraine is actually able to pursue a strategy that sometimes might not play very well in newspaper headlines, but that plays out really well where it's more important, on the actual battlefield from both a strategic and a tactical perspective. Where Ukraine is able to concentrate less forces along the front lines, and instead is able to use more rapid response units behind the front lines, so that overall the Ukrainian military needs far less soldiers to accomplish its goals than Russia does, even beyond the normal offense versus defense dynamic, which is really important for Ukraine because their population is so much smaller than Russia's. For example, we've already seen this play out around the city of Pokrovsk in a famous salient that the Russians were able to push past the front line by basically sneaking over, and there was a lot of newspaper drama that the Russians had in fact broken through. But in reality, what happened was a couple of Russians snuck over the front line because there weren't a whole lot of soldiers along the front. But these soldiers were quickly surrounded by rapid response units that came in from behind the front, and basically every single one of them was eliminated. And Russia was unable to push forward using that strategy, and they were also unable to push forward by, having so much overwhelming force on Ukrainian cities, and that's basically left Russia with no options. And it's really brilliant, and one of the reasons Ukraine can do this is because Ukraine can be extremely confident that at no point in time can Russia actually accumulate enough armor in any one position to create such an overwhelming push that Ukraine can't effectively respond to it and defeat it, especially because that push would struggle from supply chain shortages and things like that. What's notable about this strategy is that it's not just theory at this point, but it's actually working effectively. And it's working effectively despite being criticized by many analysts, despite being criticized by many of Ukraine's allies, and also despite being criticized by a lot of Ukraine's own soldiers who subjectively feel a lot of pressure, for example, from not having every piece of gear that they might want and the ability to fight the war as effectively as they could if they otherwise had everything on their wish list. Despite all of this criticism, though, Ukraine understands its math really well. First of all, they understand that they are at war, and that war is never easy, and war is never ideal, but the main thing that's important in war is whether or not you can actually achieve your objectives, not how hard it is to achieve your objectives. Ukraine has been holding Russia at bay and effectively achieving its objectives because Ukraine understands the basic math. They know that at this point in the war, Russia has lost well over 11,000 tanks. And to replace those tanks, they are only able to produce about 250 new ones every single year. Ukraine also knows that at this point in the war, Russia has lost around 23,000 armored vehicles, more than that, and they are only able to produce, for example, around 450 new infantry fighting vehicles every single year. They understand that Russia has been able to do what they've done so far because they started the war with very large stockpiles, but they have quickly been grinding through those stockpiles, and Russia can no longer replace those stockpiles fast enough even to keep every position on the front even minimally supplied, let alone to stock up enough armor to actually push through and penetrate a position. And we see here that the war really is locked at a stalemate in the sense that Russia is not going to be able to push the front line forward. Instead, Russia is trying to achieve victory by forcing Ukraine to give them everything in negotiations. Russia continually, their main demand in their negotiations is that Ukraine just gives them the remainder of the Donbass that they haven't taken yet. And the reason Russia keeps asking for this is because that includes most of Ukraine's most powerful fortress cities that Russia is incapable of taking from a military perspective. Not just that they haven't been able to take from a military perspective up to this point, but that they are incapable of taking from a military perspective because their rate of attrition is going up and their rate of production is going down. Now, in response to this, it's not as if Russia is just sitting down and doing nothing. Russia is doing everything they can to overcome these weaknesses, but the problem is they cannot do enough. What Russia is now trying to do is they are trying to amass more soldiers around particular Ukrainian positions, which is, of course, going to cause more casualties. But this plays on another side of the equation that Russia is struggling with. Sure, if you have enough soldiers, they might kind of replace an armored vehicle, although it will result in a lot of casualties. But even your soldiers, just like your armored vehicles, are not an unlimited resource. The main way that Russia has been acquiring soldiers is by, deceiving them into joining the military through large military pay, large signing bonuses, often promising these soldiers that they would serve in rear areas, but then putting them on the front. But Russia financially does not have the money to keep up this strategy anymore. The country is struggling from terrible inflation. I won't go super in-depth in this video because I have super in-depth videos on this from several different aspects, but Russia is running low on money, and so they can't recruit soldiers in the traditional sense. What they do instead is they try to conscript soldiers and then force those soldiers to sign contracts to actually join the regular military, because conscripts in Russia, they get trained, but they actually don't go to the front line unless they sign a contract to do that. They're just there to defend Russian territory. And even this tactic isn't working as well because a lot of the conscripts are becoming wise to this and they are actively resisting this. And so in order for Russia to actually get adequate soldiers, which is something they may not even be able to do in the first place, what they would eventually have to do is resort to traditional conscription, where they actually conscript people and force them to go to the offensive war in Ukraine, whether they like it or not. Now, this is a step that Russia has been unwilling to take since the start of the war, and that's very telling, because Russia is clearly afraid of taking this step. It's very clear from what Russian leadership has done that they have no moral compunctions about forcing people to go and die against their will. They do it all the time. They just do it through deceptive measures where people could blame the individual soldier rather than the Russian government. And that's kind of the key. The Russian government has been very unwilling to pursue a strategy to get manpower that would make them look directly like the bad guys. And this is clearly because they are actually terrified of how the Russian people might respond to this. People might say that's untrue. The Russian government doesn't fear its own people. Their actions say otherwise. And I've covered that in a lot of depth on a lot of videos as well. So what this means is that Russia really has no options to actually win the war in Ukraine. They can continue to hurt Ukraine potentially for quite a long time. They can continue to send drones and missiles into Ukrainian cities. They can continue to attack Ukrainian infrastructure, take out power plants, attack kindergartens, medical centers, whatever other crazy categories of civilian infrastructure they can hit. They really don't care anymore. They're just trying to get Ukraine to fold. But from a strategic perspective, from a tactical perspective, they don't have any armor. They are sending soldiers to battle on motorcycles, on donkeys, on horses. They're bringing cavalry back, even though tanks replaced cavalry a long time ago, because they simply have nothing left to turn to. So when people tell you that Russia is winning the war, they clearly have not looked at all of the facts. They clearly have not understood the situation that Russia is actually in. And while it's terrible that this war could go on for quite a long time because Russia is unwilling to quit, the fact that that is terrible doesn't change the reality. Ukraine understands the reality. This is their country they're defending, not just some war in a far-off place. These are their own people that they're trying to protect, their own citizens that they are trying to take their cities back so that they can be out of Russian control and people can go back to their homes and citizens can also be rescued from Russian occupation. And that is not a goal that Ukraine is going to quit on just because somebody asks them to do it. Because as far as Ukraine is concerned, right now they have the upper hand. They're going to continue doing what they've done for a long time, which is holding the front line as long as it takes to actually win the war. Now, as long as Ukraine continues to do their thing, Lord willing, I'm going to continue to do my thing, and I'm going to continue to create videos just like this one. So if you appreciate these videos, please do like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's completely free, but it helps me out a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, as always, there's a number of links in the description by which you can do so. It's completely voluntary. I don't put a ton of stuff behind paywalls, but I really do appreciate your support. You really do help make what I do possible. So thank you guys, and I'll see you on the next one.